Good morning, folks. This is the first of what I hope will be a regular series of Sunday morning videos from Ben Habib. And what I hope to do in these videos is to pick on some of the important issues of the week and obviously give you my thoughts on them and talk about anything else that I believe to be pertinent, and what's coming up, perhaps in the following weeks and so on. So we'll play it slightly by ear. This is my first video of its kind, and just see how this unfolds. But I hope that listeners will get some benefit out of it. These videos won't be more than 10 minutes long, so quite pithy. And I thought, since this is my first such video, that I would talk about what is, for me at least, the prevailing and most important issue that still dogs the British political scene, and that is leaving the European Union. Now, many of you, even Brexiteers, will probably be rolling your eyes thinking, damn, do we really need to talk about Brexit anymore? Haven't we done that subject to death? Well, I'm afraid it is still absolutely critical that we talk about it, because, at least from a personal perspective, the only reason I'm in politics is because I want an independent, proud, sovereign United Kingdom, free of the tentacles of Brussels and other international institutions into which it has now been gripped, and through which we are losing effectively the nation state of the United Kingdom. It really is that critical. If we don't get the Brexit that we voted for in 2016, if we can't break free of the European Union, we won't have a United Kingdom. Over time, we will cease to be. And I think many of you can see that because, increasingly, and particularly with the youth in this country, increasingly people are waking up to the fact that we've got rampant immigration, that our culture is changing, that policies are being made not for the betterment of the United Kingdom and the British people, but for people who've come to this country for international agendas such as net zero, which weren't born out of the United Kingdom for the United Kingdom, and where we're doing great damage to ourselves, right across the political spectrum. Our economy is in deep trouble, our culture as a country is in deep trouble, our constitution is in deep trouble. We've got a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, a partition down the Irish Sea, and democratically we're being hollowed out because we don't have a free hand to make laws and govern ourselves in the way that we should have been able to do so after Brexit. And the reason I go on about Brexit is because if we'd left the EU, if we hadn't signed these two new treaties that Boris Johnson signed, if we'd actually genuinely left in a dramatic fashion, with cutting those ties completely, we would have been forced as a country to take steps to protect ourselves from what would have been a belligerent European Union. And in taking those steps, and by the way, the EU, I think even Remainers would agree, is belligerent towards the UK. And in taking those steps, in taking the necessary steps to protect ourselves from the EU, we would have been forced as a country to put the nation state of the United Kingdom first. Automatically, we would have delivered a proud, independent, sovereign United Kingdom because our political class would have had no option but to do that. We would have left the rules of the EU. We've got 4,500 regulations. I'm not talking about directives from the EU, but regulations. These are things that have been drafted in Brussels and adopted into UK law without debate by Parliament and not made in any sense with British interests at heart, purely with European Union interests at heart, which, by the way, doesn't equate either to the interests of member states at heart. We've got 4,500 of these regulations on our books, which we haven't ditched. We have committed to aligning the United Kingdom with EU state aid laws, so we can't freely hand out state aid to sectors that we wish to hand it out to, such as, for example, the steel industry, which I know Richard Tice has been talking about a lot during the last week. We are tied into EU competition law, so contrary to all the promises we made about being able to buy British first when we leave the EU, actually we can't do that government tenders have to be open up to EU member state firms alongside on equal basis with British firms, unless it's a matter of state importance. But there are very limited exceptions to our having to open ourselves up to buying European Union goods. We are compromised by EU employment law, which we also have to align with. And lastly, on the regulatory front, we are still committed to European environmental law. And embedded in those treaties that Boris Johnson signed is an inability for us to ditch net zero. Net zero is unarguably, in my view, the most damaging economic policy ever adopted by a government. It's probably impossible to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And the process of trying to get there is damaging our economy incredibly and making us phenomenally vulnerable as a country. We've turned our back on North Sea gas. We've shut down our independent access to fossil fuels. We are now therefore importing fossil fuels of the very kind that we could have got out of our own North Sea. And we are unable to deliver cost-effective and reliable energy, not just to the British people, but our industry, our armed forces, and everything else that would make us economically prosperous. Net zero is terrible, and the treaty that we have with the European Union requires us to continue to go down that path. The other thing which people aren't entirely familiar with in that treaty is that we've committed to paying into Horizon Europe, which is ostensibly a scientific research program, but actually it's a scientific research program purely with EU political aims at its heart. And a component of that is the European Defence Fund. And that fund, that European Defence Fund, the research project that is the European Defence Fund, aims to create a weaponry and systems which integrate European armed forces. And that integration they champion, they celebrate it, they say it's a good thing. But actually what it would do is remove from the United Kingdom the ability to have its own independent fighting force. We would be embedded in Brussels command structures. So the treaties that Boris Johnson signed did not deliver Brexit. And of course, I haven't even touched on Northern Ireland yet, which has been completely left behind in the EU on matters of human rights, state aid. They're in dynamic alignment with the EU on state aid, excise duties, VAT. The EU's single market for goods effectively is what Northern Ireland is subject to. And increasingly, the Northern Irish economy is being damaged as a result of it. Increasingly, we will see Northern Ireland being cleaved away from Great Britain. And the tentacles of that Northern Ireland Protocol will actually, even though it's successfully pulling Northern Ireland away from us, will creep into the United Kingdom and prevent us from being able to do that which we need to do for the prosperity of our own country. So Brexit and leaving the EU is still a critical fight that we have to have. I've talked largely about the economy, and I haven't touched on the cultural impacts of not having Brexited properly. But embedded in all of that also is a commitment in those treaties that Boris Johnson signed to staying in the European Convention of Human Rights. As long as we're in the European Convention of Human Rights, we can't make laws which would allow us to protect our country from the onslaught of illegal migration. And we are hooked also, and this isn't entirely related to Brexit, but is a component part of our government and our governing class turning its back on the interests of the British people. We are hooked into this cheap drug, the drug of cheap labour, cheap imported labour. And that goes hand in hand, obviously, with illegal migration. And then all the policies that we've made to protect, promote and celebrate those who've come to the United Kingdom over and above and to the detriment of the British people. So that is a bit of a sermon on Brexit, for which, many apologies on a Sunday morning, but it's the foundation of why I'm in politics. It's the foundation, I think, of the policies that are required, using the bedrock of the need to leave the EU. I think creates, leads to the policies that are required to deliver the United Kingdom to that proud, independent, sovereign, prosperous country that we want it to be. And everything I do and say pretty much is governed with this bedrock in mind. So every subsequent little video that I do, even though I might be talking about a whole array of different subjects, actually underpinning my ideology is the stuff that I've just been talking about this morning. It's not a conclusive and exhaustive list of things that I've discussed this morning, but I think you get the picture. And I hope this first little video has been of interest. Thank you very much for listening.